Welcome to WORLDbytes against Austerity Desk. My name is Mizanur Rahman and today we are exploring debt. To do this, we are delighted to have with us in the studio Phil Mullan. Phil is Business Transformation Director with Easynet Global Services. He is also researching global economic trends and writing a book on the limits of fudge, why muddling through can't work forever. So Phil, today excessive debt and the need to reduce it is seen as the most pressing economic challenge. What do you make of this?
Well, it's not just in Europe. I mean, debt is the big issue across, all the Western countries. It's the big issue in the United States as well as in Britain and in mainland Europe. I mean, I think the focus on debt today is a bit misplaced by looking at debt in its own terms, because I think that is looking too much at consequences, the economic consequence of something rather than the economic causes. When you have underlying problems which are very deep, these tend to express themselves in high levels of debt. So I think it's best to see the high levels of debt today, which everyone is so worried about, much more as a consequence, as a symptom, as an expression of something else. And that something else is the very dire state of our current economic malaise. A lot of people in America, in Europe, in Britain, tend to blame the economic crisis on debt itself. But I think that sees things upside down, back to front. What we are living through at the moment is a situation where we've had, across most of the Western societies, over something like 30 or 40 years, we've had a decay in the ability of those countries to be able to produce the goods and services which we all need to live on and which are the basis of our prosperity. And what's happened is that during that time of economic decay, different institutions and ourselves as people and governments have borrowed a lot more in order to compensate for the fact that that basic production of wealth, that basic production of value has not been happening as well as it used to. And these debts have built up and built up and built up over the years. At some stage, those debts become too large to be able to address and deal with and service effectively. And that's what expressed itself in the big Western financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. And so when we see that sort of problem happen, I think it's very important we don't do just a knee-jerk reaction and say, hey, we've had a financial crisis, that crisis was caused by debt, that must be the problem today. We have to look deeper and look what it is that led to that debt increase in the first place. I think also we should see that debt, which has a very bad name today, is seen as being this big problem. Debt shouldn't be stigmatized, because debt can be actually a very good thing for society. I mean, debt, if it's used for productive investment, can actually help everybody to have those higher standards of living, that greater benefits of prosperity. I mean, if you take something like the United States, we think of the United States today, maybe a little bit in decline, but it built itself up to be the world's leading industrial superweight. People forget that that path or that progress which America had of moving from a backward, underdeveloped frontier society to being an industrial behemoth was based on huge amounts of debt. If the debt hadn't happened, if America hadn't been able to borrow, it would still be, a very backward, underdeveloped country. So debt can be good for a society if it's used productively. The problem is when debt is used for things which do not help us all, when debt is simply used, say, for unproductive consumption, or debt is used for allowing house prices to rise. Things like that can then create difficulties for us. I think to focus on debt in itself, in its own terms, I think is counterproductive. And I think it's ineffective. I think it's ineffective because it doesn't deal with what are the factors, what are the drivers for leading to everyone borrowing in the first place. You're still going to have those there, even if you just try and cut back today. And I think it's also counterproductive because it diverts attention from looking at those problems, which means those underlying essential problems are festering and worsening all the time. But I think also there's a specific counterproductive feature, which is that the focus on austerity, the focus on cutting back, is actually sending out the sort of message of saying we've got to make do with less. And that's the opposite of what we need. What we should be doing is inculcating a message that we've got to create more wealth in order so that we're not so dependent on debt for our prosperity and living standards.
Why specifically has the UK's debt become so huge and now surpassed the trillion mark?
Well, the trillion mark sounds like a very big number, and to you and me, of course, it is a very big number. I think it's a 1 with about 12 zeros on the end of it. But I don't think there's anything special about that particular number, that particular milestone that's been passed. Why has the debt been growing? Very simply, year in, year out, the British government has been spending more than it's been taking in revenue. And the British government's not different to many other Western governments. Basically, across the Western world, governments have become used to borrowing in order to subsidise their year-on-year expenditure. And that's, as they've been going on for not just in Britain and elsewhere, but it's been going on for a long time, probably 100 years in Britain. Look back to the First World War, many, many more years than not, the British government has been borrowing in order to fund itself. That's not really unique. I think if you look at the last 10 years, there has been, over that period, an acceleration of borrowing by the British government. And I think that tells us something different about the character of the economy, because what we've had is that the British government, even though there was a recovery going on, supposedly, during the years from 2002 to 2007, and usually in that period, borrowing will decline because there'll be no more tax revenues being raised. In that period, the British government was unable to cut back on its spending, unable to cut back on its deficits. And that's the thing that's really driven the growth in the first part of the decade. And of course, since the recession in 2008, borrowing has increased even more. And that's what's driven debt in Britain through that symbolic 1 trillion mark.
So on that basis, should we worry about the size of the UK's debt in relation to its GDP, for example?
I think we should look at it and understand why it's increasing, but I don't think we should worry about it to distraction. The ratio is roughly 65%. 2/3 of the economy is the measure for national debt, so 65%. And that has increased a lot. As I was saying earlier, there's been a big increase in government national debt because of increased borrowing since the early 2000s, when I think it was about 30%. So we've seen a doubling of the ratio of debt to GDP over that period. So that's something to at least investigate and understand as to why that is happening. I think 65% is not a number that we should get too worried or too obsessed about, though. We can see that there are other countries which have much higher levels of debt. Now, that's not to say, therefore, one should be complacent, but if you look at Japan, its level of debt is about 200% at the moment, and it's still coping, not doing tremendously well, but not doing all that much worse than others. And, of course, you've got European countries like Italy and Greece with well above 100%. But I think it's perhaps even more interesting to see that 65% for Britain is not some record that's been surpassed. There have been many occasions in the past where British national debt has been much, much higher than 65%. In fact, if you go back over the last 100 years, for more than half that time, the debt level in Britain, the national debt, has been the equivalent or more of the size of the economy. So it's been at the 100% level or more. And in fact, if you look back even longer, Britain's had a national debt going back 300 years, back to, I think it was William III, who was the first monarch to borrow money, 1692, I think, for one of his wars. If you look back at that entire period, 300 plus years, for more than half the time, the debt has been much, much higher than it is today. So it's not that high today, but it's the rate of growth, which is perhaps something which we should understand what's happening, and therefore what's likely to happen into the future. Just dwelling a little bit more on the historical side, because it does put into context what's going on today, there are two main drivers for increasing national debt in Britain's case, and this applies also to the other leading economies, have been major wars, which are very expensive for governments. So when you have a war, generally the debt increases, and slumps. And I think today, fortunately, while we're in some military conflicts in parts of the world, we're not in a major war. The reason that debt is a cause for concern in terms of its rate of change is because of the underlying economic depression, the economic slump. The lesson from history is why did the debt decrease? What was happening in the world that the debt fell from what it was like in the time of the Napoleonic Wars? It was over 200% of GDP. Perhaps more recently, at the end of the Second World War, it was over 200% of GDP. What happened that those debt levels fell? And the important thing to see in the context of a discussion about the value of austerity today is that it wasn't austerity which reduced the debt levels. What happened was that the economies were doing pretty well in those periods after the Napoleonic Wars and after the Second World War. The 2/3 of the 19th century, from the end of the wars with France, was the high point of Britain's industrial strength and leadership in the world. Very strong time for the British economy, and as a result, the size of the economy grew, and it was able to pay off debt, and the debt levels fell. Similarly, after the Second World War, we had this 25-year period of the post-war boom. Again, relatively speaking, the British economy was doing pretty well, and you saw the level of national debt fall from, I think it was a peak of 250% at the end of the Second World War, down to about 50% in the early 1970s. Again, that wasn't the result of austere governments, it was a result of the fact that you had an economy which was growing, and therefore the ratio of debt to GDP was one which fell to what was seen as manageable levels. The question is really not what is the level of debt, is it 65% or 80% or 100%, but is it reasonable to think that the British economy is going to grow again in the same way that it did in the post-war years to allow the debt to fall again, or at least to be maintained? And that's where we've got a problem, because the indications today is that there doesn't look to be any possibility of a strong, healthy recovery.
The coalition government and the opposition have made debt the key reason to enforce austerity measures. You seem to be suggesting that they may be wrong.
I do think austerity is the wrong way, because I think it is an approach which says if we level down, if we all make do with less, somehow that will solve the problem. So say if you see that the debt is more a symptom of something else, then you can see that austerity is actually going to be counterproductive to addressing what needs to happen. So we do have a problem, let me get this straight, on being a debt-dependent society. You know, societies which are living through the future or through mortgaging off the future are not going to be able to sustain themselves forever. So we have to do something about the debt. But to attack it directly through the austerity measures, through cutting public spending, is dealing with what I would say is really a tertiary problem. And when you deal with the tertiary problems, then clearly you're not dealing with a secondary and you're not dealing with a primary problem. What happened about 30, 40 years ago was that the economy slowed down in Britain, as it did in most of the Western world. The ability to increase productivity, which is the basis of rising prosperity, fell away. Once that happened, the economy then became dependent on private debt. Basically, businesses and banks and us as individuals began to borrow a lot more to offset the fact that the economy was not producing things. So we had the growth of private debt. That's sort of the secondary problem, the secondary phenomenon that arose because of the economic slowdown. And it's only really in the last 10 years that state spending has begun to become the more dominant form of support for the economy. We've got this takeoff of state debt, public debt, national debt over the last period. But if you're just dealing with this tertiary, this third level phenomenon, then you're not dealing with the underlying malaise. And that's where I think the coalition government and the opposition in its approach to supporting austerity is going wrong. I mean, I've stressed that I think debt is a symptom of something else. And that really begs the question, though, what is that something else? And there are politicians today, a lot of them, unfortunately, who are starting to ask that question, but I think giving the wrong answer. Because the answer they're giving is that debt is a symptom of some form of moral decay. There's a way in which debt has become not just an economic term anymore, it's become a very heavily moralized term. You have politicians who are saying that the debt is an expression or a symptom of irresponsible behaviour, greedy behaviour, feckless behaviour. They'll say that individuals are in too much debt because they just want to have lots of extravagant lifestyles, and they're mortgaging the future, and they're sort of taking wealth away from their children and their grandchildren. So they're being immoral in the way that they are borrowing, too greedy. Governments as well, the argument will be is that governments have also been feckless and irresponsible in spending too much, and as a result that's got to be cut back, that we can't live that way forever. And that sort of moralising of the discussion is, I think, very unhelpful, because it mystifies that really what's at issue isn't some expression of moral decay in the fact that people are borrowing. What's being expressed here is not moral decay, but is economic decay. Very simple, the relationship between debt and the economy, really. They move in opposite directions. If you have an economy which is lacking in vitality, you will tend to see debt grow. The reason for that is because all of us, individuals, businesses and governments, will attempt to maintain their customary standard of expenditure, even though the resources are not there. So people are borrowing not for irresponsible reasons, people are borrowing simply to maintain their previous level of economic activity. And I challenge anyone to argue that somehow our health service or our education service or the support that we're giving to pensioners, whatever, is somehow extravagant or over the top. Clearly not anyone who's been in hospital or is working in our schools at the moment. It's not extravagant to simply try to maintain the previous levels of expenditure. The problem is that while doing that, they've avoided challenging or asking the question, why is it that we can no longer generate enough revenues to be able to keep our customary standard of living? Why is it that people have to borrow more in order to be able to maintain their customary standard of living? It's because their incomes aren't rising so fast. Why is it that businesses are having to borrow more? That's because they're not making enough profits. Why is it that governments are having to borrow more? That's because they can't raise enough in tax revenues. So it all comes back to this basic point that it's the economic underpinning of society which is what we have to look at, and not simply think that by cutting spending this year or cutting spending next year, somehow that's going to right everything and get everything back to a level keel. Unless you're doing something to generate faster growth, that's never going to happen.
Debt is also the focus on the discussion on the euro. The Greeks have taken a hammering on their debt. What do you make of this?
I think you're right to draw out that point. The eurozone crisis is very much viewed through the prism of debt. But here again, I think people are seeing things back to front, I'm afraid. The eurozone problem is one which rests in the very wide differentials in economic productivity between the countries which are in the eurozone. And that's what's pulling the eurozone apart at the present time. Even if you look at just the sequence of things, again, what's actually happened to the eurozone tells the lie to this obsession today with fiscal discipline, with austerity, with forcing the Greeks and the Italians and the Irish and the Spanish and just about everybody to cut back on their public spending. Because for a lot of the time, even in the weaker economies, for a lot of the period since the eurozone was set up 10 years ago, public spending has been in surplus, not in deficit. Look at Ireland and Spain. For most of the years up to 2007, they were not borrowing money every year. The sovereign debt crisis, as they call it then, is again a symptom or an expression of the financial crisis causing a recession. I would argue that the eurozone itself, as this very dysfunctional institution, which was imposed upon the European people without any democratic mandate, is that the eurozone itself, as a structure, has created the form that the debt crisis is taking today. You see, what happened is that the eurozone was meant that it was possible for very weak countries, and Greece is economically a very weak country, and the same applies to Portugal and in relative terms to Ireland too, is that these countries were able to do a lot more in the way of borrowing privately than would have been possible if they'd been outside the eurozone. The eurozone sort of gave them a comfort, and gave, most importantly, the people who were lending to them a comfort that they could lend as much as they wanted to Greece because it was part of this big wealthy bloc and they'd be able to pay back at some stage. And they lent at very cheap rates. So the Greek society and the Greek government took advantage of that. Similarly, in Ireland and in Spain, the private sector there took advantage of these very easy, low interest rate borrowings. And as a result, they were able to fuel housing booms, they were able to keep their consumption higher. So actually the eurozone itself created a much bigger financial bubble than would have been the case in the absence of it. And now, whenever everyone felt the pain from the financial crisis of 2007-2008, the eurozone again made things worse because the eurozone prevented those weaker countries from devaluing, which is what Britain's done, what America's done. The way they've tried to cope with their recessions has been to devalue their currencies, because that allows them, artificially perhaps, but it certainly has an effect in making them more competitive again. Being in a fixed currency bloc, which is what the eurozone is, has precluded the Italys and the Greeces and the Portugals of the world of being able to pursue that route. As a result, the recession has been deeper, and as a result, their public debts have shot up over the last 3 years. So again, if you look at it, what seems to be the problem today, what is manifest as these very, very heavy debts that people have, and obviously in Greece we're getting to a stage that they're unable to repay it, or well past that stage I would say. But again, what it is an expression of is something different. It's the underlying weakness, or in the Eurozone's case, the weakness amplified by the unevenness across the whole region.
You said that debt isn't the actual problem, but rather the symptom. Does that mean that we should accept cuts, have austerity measures enforced onto us, and have our living standards lowered even lower?
Well, I think there are other ways, but unfortunately I don't think there's any pain-free ways out of the economic malaise that we're in. That's the sad fact of the situation. We are inheriting something which has been, I say, 30, 40 years of a build-up of problems. I think we all have to accept that no society can live beyond its means indefinitely. No society, and this applies to individuals or governments, can continue to rack up debts year in, year out in order to consume more than it is able to produce. So, there is a harsh reality there. The issue is, how do we go about addressing that? And I think austerity is, as I've been arguing, goes in the wrong direction. But the alternative of how we cure the problem is not going to be one which doesn't also have an impact, at least for a short period, on living standards. So I don't think we should accept a tax on living standards, but I think we should be open and honest and recognise that the sort of restructuring which has to take place in society in order to overcome the economic malaise is not going to be something which is an easy and pain-free and smooth process, because the weak, unproductive parts of the economy will have to go to the wall. In fact, I'd be arguing for less bailouts, arguing very strongly for less bailouts, for less support for saving what exists at the moment, and for governments, and therefore it will have implications for us, to accept the necessity to do a much more radical, corrective surgery on the economy, in a sense, of getting rid of what is not good and creating the conditions for building up something which is much more capable and effective in producing the sort of wealth which we need to sustain both today's living standards and also those in the future. But during that transition period, we could well see cuts in living standards. But I think if that is justified, and if that is motivated, and if that is discussed across society as part of a plan for rebuilding prosperity for the future, then I think that's a path which people would take. As I say, there's no painless way out. The problem of what's been advanced and recommended and being implemented by governments across the West today is a policy of pain with no benefit at the end of it, because it doesn't help to get out of the economic malaise. I think if we can accept that there is a better future through doing the restructuring of our banks, the restructuring of our productive systems, the restructuring of our debts, then that is something which, if it's part of a proper national discussion, is something that people would see the unfortunate necessity for. What we need is not to make do with less, but to make more wealth in order that we can have better prosperity in the future. And the debt focus is taking us away from that. The debt focus alone takes us away from that, but the best way to overcome the debt, the best cure for the debt, is to have industrial expansion, and industrial expansion will be the thing which will in time give us jobs, and therefore it will allow us to cut unemployment benefits. It will give us the incomes upon which the government can tax ourselves. It will therefore create the possibility of not just cutting the borrowing, but actually using the public spending in order to create or support the basis of a durable recovery. That's what we need. That's what's lacking at the moment. That's what austerity is taking us away from. We instead need to get to that underlying need for restructuring and to build prosperity for the future.
Thanks, Phil. It's been interesting to hear your views on debt. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. However, join us on our next Against Austerity program.